All right. Actually, it's a pleasure to be here. I was hoping that we'd get a group of good students because I think I'm addressing this talk to different students to energize your vision and your interest in mental health. What are the theoretical orientations of what I want to share with you today? This work attempts to look at the psyche and subjectivity and Puerto Rican mental health of the diaspora, that is, Puerto Ricans in the mainland. Trauma theory and melancholia both come from psychoanalytic thinking and from post-colonial critiques about coloniality. To the degree that we may be considered post-colonial, that's being debated hotly. Because you do not have a colonial administration, that doesn't mean you're still uncolonized or you're decolonized. No, on the contrary, what coloniality says is that colonial relations persist, unfortunately, and survive post the administration period, and persist precisely in our psyche. And the difficulty has always been how we enter into processes of decolonialization. And for us, that may even be more difficult because Puerto Rico has a problem that it doesn't know it's colonized. It acts as if it isn't, okay? It acts as if it was a first world country and has never come to grips with the fact that we have had an experience of 500 years of colonialization that definitely leaves marks in the psyche of a people. This is Freud's, one of his most interesting developments. He wrote a paper on mourning and melancholia, and he indicated that the melancholic refuses to relinquish the lost, loved object, but is unconscious of this. In mourning the loss of the conscious, he learns to resolve it. But if you don't mourn, if you cannot resolve, then you have maintained an open wound. Cultural critics are using this concept, the inability to mourn. Mourning is a conscious process. Melancholia is an unconscious process. If you do not mourn, you are at risk, if you will, of suffering from melancholia. So how does this relate to the diaspora? What the cultural critics have said, and this is where it's an interesting way of tying it, is that melancholia helps explain the wounds of history, the open wounds of history, the wounds that people who have been displaced from their lands have upon the loss of a homeland. Let me move into a case. This was a Puerto Rican man who was an ex-cane cutter. I didn't see it here. He was 52 years old when I saw him. He had been in the United States for about a year. He had lost his job. He was here with a family. He had 2 or 3 kids. He was living right near Villa Victoria, which is a part of the Puerto Rican community in Massachusetts. And he comes to the United States, and his brother gets him a job at a factory putting nuts and bolts. And he comes in with depression and feeling that his life is over. He doesn't know what to do. He's angry. Everybody's told him that he's angry. His wife told him he's angry. He's threatening him that you better get help because, anger is another form of internalized or externalized depression, as we conceptualize it. And so he comes in and we start doing history, and he starts talking about when he was a sugarcane cutter and when he was out in the fields and that whole experience. I love histories and narratives, So, for me it was incredible to hear him. But he came with the symptom not of anger. He came with a somatic symptom. He came with the symptom that his back hurt. Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, even though I was just getting my Ph.D., things didn't quite come together. I didn't quite get to analyze what was happening in this man until years later. Did I have like, oh my God, it was years after that I was able to really understand what I think was happening with this man. Think of it. He's depressed, he's angry, he was a cane cutter, a sugar cane cutter since he was a kid. 14, 15 years old, his whole life. He comes in complaining that his back hurts. How do you cut cane? What do you always use? Not that it necessarily has to hurt, but what do you always use? Okay. If we do an analysis, psychoanalytically, of his complaint, of his history, and we incorporate the notion of a loss, a trauma for a loss that he did not mourn because he didn't realize that that was a real loss. He lost not the fact that you lose a job, that is a loss. He lost something more. He lost a livelihood. He lost his identification. He didn't just lose leaving the island because he didn't have a job. He lost his whole world vision, his whole sense of being. That's a very difficult situation to be in. His back, he had no physiological reason to have back pain. He had somaticized, that's what somatization is, the pain through a mechanism in his psyche. But the pain reminded him, that symptom was the memory of the loss. And while he had the symptom, he was closer and had a contact with that loss. So melancholia is interesting. I do think that there's evidence that the first groups of Puerto Ricans who came to Puerto Rico, came from Puerto Rico to New York, may have suffered melancholia, but they worked it through by precisely developing pequeños barrios, pequeños centros, the centro cultural of el barrio, the centro cultural of this and that. They started to develop community, Puerto Rican community. So when you see these old pictures that used to be up here, okay, you see the storefront of so-and-so, the community center, groupings, because that was one way of keeping the homeland alive here. And that is an adaptive force. When you can't do that, or for some reason it doesn't happen, you may not have that resource to buffer the loss, the sentiments of loss. How has the community in the United States pulled away? How has it transformed its mourning to healing? What evidence do we have that that might be happening? The evidence that I think is when I look at the workings of the artist. When I look of artists born, raised, or in the United States, at the creativity of their voices, it seems to me that they're working through these issues of loss, relocation, dislocation, looking for sense of self, looking for sense of activity. Look at the welfare poets. I happen to know their work for the last, 10 years. They do them, if you don't know them, most of you probably know them. The welfare poets are very creative. They use hip hop, they use jam, they use, and they speak out, and they are reconstructing their identity. And look at the play, La Gringa. What happens with La Gringa? It's a play. She goes back to Puerto Rico. It's a play of a Puerto Rican young woman who's raised here, and this image of Puerto Rico, viva Puerto Rico, go back to Puerto Rico, and you go back to Puerto Rico, and you get just treated badly. And suddenly, your heart goes to the floor, And she comes back, and what does she learn? She learns what Mariposa Fernandez said. Yo no nací en Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico nació en mí. You know that phrase in her poem. I was not born in Puerto Rico was born in me. Some of the voices that we hear, you know, there's nostalgia. ¿Quién soy? Who am I? En la lucha. I'm going and I'm coming. I'm on a, you know, guagua. Where's the guagua aérea? I didn't make it. Okay. I'm a Diasporican. I'm from here, de aquí, de allá. You know, I'm displaced. These are all words that over the years you hear, and they're in the literature about our experience. Where are we from? And you know the last one on the corner, Dusmik. Does anybody here know what that is? That construction was the brainchild of un muchacho Figuera of the New York Poets Puerto Rican Cafe, who, it doesn't mean anything. He constructed it, but it means something very important. It doesn't mean, you know, the word Dusmik, you know, it's not siglas for something. What it is, and that's why I want to start with it, it means the turning of aggression and oppression into strength. They came up with this, and they were interviewed in a magazine that I read years ago. This is in Miguel Algarin's book of Antología. Dusmik was to me the turning of aggression and oppression into strength, which is what we want to do.